So yes, once again, we're looking at my American Woman's Cookbook Wartime Edition from 1942. And this is part of the Wartime Cookery section in the back. And we're going to do the squash cakes. And so it calls for a quarter cup cake of yeast, a quarter cup of lukewarm water, 1 cup boiled winter squash, 1 egg well beaten, half a cup of sugar, a quarter teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 cup milk scalded, and 1 cup sifted flour. If you will note here at the bottom, you can do it as pumpkin cakes and use a cup of strained cooked pumpkin instead. I used canned pumpkin. That seemed to meet the criteria. But it's soften yeast in lukewarm water, rub squash through a strainer and add egg, sugar, salt, butter, and milk. Cool to lukewarm, add softened yeast and flour. Cover and let rise in a warm place overnight. Shape into biscuits and let rise about 20 minutes. Bake in moderate oven, 350 degrees for 12 to 15 minutes. Makes 1.5 dozen cakes. I'm going to point out that this recipe is flawed. You're going to see how later. So, with a little bit of research, I found that a cake of yeast was 3 packages of yeast. So a package of dry yeast is 2 1/4 teaspoons, so I just did 2 teaspoons. I used canned pumpkin, 1 cup of it, because that was easier than going and buying a pumpkin, cooking it up, and straining it. I've discovered I really hate straining things. Once again, I have a fresh egg donated by my coworker Julie. And while I'm working on putting these together, of course, the yeast is in the water softening. There's a 1/2 cup of sugar, the salt, and the butter. I am going to assume that because this thing was calling for cooked pumpkin, it was assuming all of this would still be warm. And I did scald the milk, but probably still wasn't quite warm enough to melt the butter appropriately. So I ended up taking it out, melting it, and pouring it back in. And I just put the whole thing into my KitchenAid. And it's a yeast bread, so I'm starting out with a bread hook here. This was a mistake. Just saying. It was mistake number 1. But I sifted the flour in and added the yeast mixture and started to mix that up as well. So after adding the flour and yeast mixture, I turned the mixer back on, still using the bread hook. But this thing isn't coalescing into a dough, so I switched to my whisk. And it's looking more and more like a batter. I was very concerned at this point, but I let it sit overnight. And in the morning, I dusted it with some flour and proceeded to try to form it up like a biscuit. And it's still a batter instead of a dough. I know that there's no way I am forming this into biscuits with this texture. So I wash my hands, I pull out a spatula, and I start adding flour. Dusting it in at about a tablespoon at a time. I'm going to have to remake this to see how much flour I actually need, but I'm going to guess I probably added at least another cup's worth of flour to this mixture to make it a dough that I could roll out and cut like biscuits. Eventually I get a soft dough and pour that out onto a floured surface and start kneading more flour into it. Yeah. I really think there must have been a typo in this recipe. As you can see, when I'm filming these, I'm usually filming the very first time I ever make this recipe. It's not something I've practiced. We're going to just see how it works. And this time, it needed a lot of work to work. I think there are a few of these recipes that I want to go back and do over in a way that will function better than they did in the original recipe. If you're interested in seeing that, let me know. But I rolled these out and proceeded to cut them with my biscuit cutter. I went for a small one. I was taking these to a potluck, and I figured it was better to have several small ones. It was supposed to make 18. I think I ended up with a little over 2 dozen. Then I put these in the oven at 350. They turned out pretty well, but I probably did dust it with a little too much flour to try to keep my biscuit cutter from sticking to the dough. But look at that crumb. It was so nice. It was a very soft bread. These went over very well at the potluck. And one thing I will note is that letting the dough sit overnight, it had a little bit of a sourdough smell to the dough in the morning, and I think it really made a nice bread. I will say, calling this a pumpkin cake was a little misleading. This was not very sweet at all. It was more like a nice dinner roll.